black girl cries in basement cage, until police arrive and the truth is revealed. The emergency call came through at 11:43 on a cold Tuesday night in the small town of Millbrook, Alabama. The dispatcher, Margaret Chen, had been working the night shift for 12 years, but the voice on the other end of the line made her blood run cold. The caller was whispering, terrified, barely able to form words. "Please help. There's a child. She's locked in a cage in the basement. You have to come quick. She's not moving much. I think she might be dying." Margaret sat up straighter in her chair, her training kicking in immediately. She motioned to her supervisor while keeping her voice calm and steady. "Ma'am, I need you to stay on the line. What's your location?" The address came through in broken whispers, and Margaret dispatched units immediately. 2 patrol cars were sent to 4782 Willow Street, a run-down neighborhood on the edge of town where the streetlights barely worked and hope seemed to have abandoned the residents long ago. Officer Marcus Thompson was the first to arrive at the scene. He had been on the force for 15 years, had seen things that would haunt most people for a lifetime, but nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to discover. The house stood dark against the night sky, its windows covered with heavy curtains that blocked any light from escaping. The front yard was overgrown with weeds, and a broken fence leaned dangerously to one side. Marcus approached the front door cautiously, his hand resting on his service weapon. His partner, Officer Janet Rodriguez, covered him from behind. They knocked on the door, announcing themselves as police officers. When no answer came, they heard it, a faint whimpering sound coming from somewhere below. Marcus didn't hesitate. He kicked the door open, the old wood splintering under the force. The smell hit them immediately, a mixture of mold, human waste, and something else, something that spoke of prolonged suffering and neglect. They moved through the house quickly, following the sounds that grew louder as they found the basement. The stairs creaked under their weight as they descended into darkness. Janet's flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing a sight that would forever change both officers. In the corner of the basement, inside a metal cage barely large enough for a large dog, was a small figure. A little girl, no more than 8 years old, was curled up in a ball, her dark skin covered in bruises and cuts. She was wearing nothing but a torn t-shirt, shivering in the damp cold of the basement. Her eyes, when she looked up at them, held a terror so deep that Marcus felt his heart shattered. "It's okay, sweetheart," he said, his voice breaking as he rushed to the cage. "We're here to help you. You're safe now." The girl didn't respond, just continued to stare with those haunted eyes. The lock on the cage was a heavy padlock, and Marcus called for bolt cutters while Janet radioed for an ambulance and backup. As they waited, Janet knelt beside the cage, speaking softly to the child, trying to offer comfort through the bars. When the bolt cutters arrived, Marcus cut through the lock with a fury he had never felt before. The moment the cage door swung open, he reached in gently, but the girl pressed herself against the back corner, terrified of human touch. It took several minutes of soft words and patient coaxing before she allowed Marcus to lift her out. She weighed almost nothing, her body frail and malnourished. As he carried her up the stairs, she whispered something that made his blood boil with rage. "Please don't tell him I talked. He'll hurt me worse." The house's owner, 42-year-old Robert Garrison, arrived home just as the ambulance was, loading the girl inside. He was a respected member of the community, a businessman who owned several properties in town. When he saw the police cars and ambulance, his face went pale. "What's going on here?" he demanded, trying to maintain an air of authority. Marcus had to be physically restrained by his fellow officers to keep from attacking the man right there. The truth began to unfold in the hours that followed. The girl's name was Keisha Williams, and her story was one of unimaginable cruelty and systematic abuse. She had been adopted by Robert Garrison 2 years earlier through what authorities would later discover was an illegal arrangement. Her biological mother, struggling with addiction and poverty, had been convinced to give up her daughter with promises that she would have a better life. Instead, Keisha had been kept as a prisoner in Garrison's home, forced to clean and serve him while being locked in the cage whenever she misbehaved or when guests came over. The neighbors had occasionally heard crying, but Garrison always had an explanation. He was fostering a difficult child with behavioral problems, he would say, and sometimes she had tantrums. People believed him because of his standing in the community. They chose to look the other way rather than ask uncomfortable questions at the hospital. Doctors found evidence of prolonged abuse and severe malnutrition. Keisha had fractures that had healed incorrectly, suggesting she had been denied medical care. She was severely underweight and showed signs of psychological trauma that would take years to heal. Child psychologist Dr. Sarah Mitchell was brought in to work with Keisha, and slowly, over several days, more details emerged. Garrison had told Keisha that no one would believe her if she tried to tell anyone what was happening. He said that because she was black and he was a wealthy white man, the police would take his side. He had convinced her that her mother had sold her, that no one wanted her, and that the cage was the only home she deserved. The psychological manipulation was as cruel as the physical abuse. But Keisha was stronger than Garrison had counted on. Despite everything, she had held on to a small spark of hope, drawing pictures on scraps of paper when she could find them, creating stories in her mind of a day when someone would save her. The person who had made the emergency call was revealed to be Maria Santos, a cleaning woman who had been hired to clean Garrison's house that day. She had been told never to go into the basement, but when she heard crying, she couldn't ignore it. She had seen Keisha in the cage and immediately left the house to call 911 from her car, terrified but determined to help. Her courage in making that call had saved Keisha's life. As news of the case spread through Millbrook, the community was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about itself. How many people had suspected something was wrong but chosen to stay silent? How many had accepted Garrison's explanations without question because it was easier than getting involved? The case became a mirror reflecting the town's failings. Its willingness to look the other way when confronting abuse would have been inconvenient or uncomfortable. The investigation revealed that Garrison had connections to a larger network, involved in illegal adoptions and human trafficking. He had used his business connections and reputation to operate without scrutiny for years. Documents found in his home showed that Keisha was not his first victim. There had been others, children who had disappeared into the system or whose whereabouts were unknown. The FBI was brought in, and the investigation expanded across state lines. More arrests were made, and more children were found and rescued. Each child had a story of abuse and neglect, of being told they were worthless, of being kept in conditions that stripped them of their humanity. The systematic nature of the abuse shocked even seasoned investigators. This was not just one evil man, but an entire network that had operated in the shadows, preying on vulnerable children and families. During Garrison's trial, Keisha had to testify. The courtroom was packed with media and community members who had come to bear witness. Keisha, now 9 years old and having spent months in therapy and foster care, sat in the witness chair, her small hands folded in her lap. When asked to identify the man who had hurt her, she pointed at Garrison without hesitation. Her voice, though quiet, was steady as she described the cage, the darkness, the hunger, and the fear. She talked about how she would imagine her mother coming to save her, how she would pray every night for someone to hear her cries. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of people crying. Even the judge had to pause to compose himself. Garrison's defense attorney tried to discredit Keisha's testimony, suggesting she was confused or had been coached, but Keisha's truth was undeniable. The physical evidence, the testimony of doctors and psychologists, and the documents found in Garrison's home all supported her account. The prosecutor, District Attorney Michelle Johnson, was particularly moved by one piece of evidence, a small notebook that Keisha had hidden in the basement. In it, she had drawn pictures and written words when she could. One page showed a figure in a cage with tears falling like rain, and above it, in shaky handwriting, were the words, "Somebody please help me." Another page had a drawing of a house with windows full of light and a little girl standing outside, free. These drawings became powerful evidence of Keisha's suffering, but also of her incredible resilience and hope. During closing arguments, Johnson held up the notebook and said, "This child never gave up hope that someone would hear her cry for help. She believed in a world that had failed her. We cannot fail her again." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all charges. Garrison was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But the story didn't end with Garrison's conviction. Keisha's journey to healing was just beginning. She was placed with a loving foster family, James and Patricia Davis, who had experience working with traumatized children. They provided her with the stability, love, and patience she needed to begin rebuilding her life. It wasn't easy. Keisha had nightmares, flashbacks, and struggled to trust anyone. She would sometimes hide food in her room, afraid it would be taken away. She was scared of basements and small spaces. But slowly, with therapy, love, and support, she began to heal. She started school, where teachers worked with her to catch up on the education she had missed. She made friends, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. She discovered she loved to draw and paint, using art as a way to express feelings she couldn't put into words. Her art teacher, Mr. Johnson, recognized her talent and encouraged her, providing her with supplies and entering her work in competitions. The community of Millbrook also had to reckon with its role in what had happened. Town meetings were held, where difficult conversations took place about how to prevent such tragedies in the future. New protocols were established for reporting suspected abuse. Training programs were implemented for teachers, neighbors, and community members on recognizing signs of abuse and the importance of speaking up. Maria Santos, the cleaning woman who had made the call that saved Keisha, was honored by the city. But she always said she only did what anyone should do. She became an advocate for children's rights, speaking at schools and community centers about the importance of listening to your instincts and protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The case also led to legislative changes at the state level, with new laws passed to strengthen oversight of adoptions and foster care placements. 5 years after her rescue, Keisha, now 14, stood before a crowd at a child advocacy event. She had grown into a confident young woman, though the shadows of her past were still visible in her eyes. She spoke about her experience, not with bitterness, but with a determination to help other children who might be suffering in silence. "I survived because someone finally listened," she said, her voice strong and clear. Someone finally believed that my life mattered. Every child deserves that. Every child deserves to be heard, to be believed, to be saved. Her speech received a standing ovation, but more importantly, it inspired action. Organizations were formed. Funds were raised, and programs were implemented to protect vulnerable children. Keisha's story became a catalyst for change, proof that even from the darkest circumstances, light could emerge. Officer Marcus Thompson, who had carried Keisha out of that cage, stayed in touch with her throughout her recovery. He became like an uncle to her, attending her school plays, her art shows, and eventually her high school graduation. At her graduation party, he gave her a compass with an inscription. "You always knew the direction of hope." They both cried as she hugged him, thanking him for giving her a chance at life. Janet Rodriguez, his partner that night, went on to specialize in crimes against children, becoming a detective who dedicated her career to protecting the vulnerable. She often thought of Keisha when working difficult cases, remembering that behind every statistic was a child who deserved to be saved. The image of Keisha in that cage never left her, but instead of haunting her, it drove her to ensure no child would suffer in silence on her watch. Robert Garrison died in prison 3 years into his sentence, beaten by fellow inmates who had learned about his crimes. There was no sympathy for him, no mourners at his funeral. His estate was liquidated, with the proceeds going to a fund for his victims. His name became synonymous with evil in Millbrook, a reminder of what can happen when power and privilege are used to prey on the vulnerable. But more than being remembered for his crimes, the case became known for the courage of those who stood up against him. Maria Santos, who made the call, the officers who rescued Keisha, the prosecutors who fought for justice, and most of all, Keisha herself, who survived and thrived despite everything. The basement where Keisha had been held was eventually demolished, the house torn down and the land turned into a memorial garden. At its center stands a sculpture of a cage with its door broken open, and emerging from it, a figure reaching toward the sky. The plaque reads, "In memory of all children who have suffered in silence, and in honor of those who speak up to save." Then Keisha was there for the dedication, now 16, standing tall and proud. She placed the first flower at the memorial, a white rose for innocence lost and recovered. As she stood there, she thought about the scared little girl she had been locked in darkness, crying out for help. That girl had been heard, had been saved, had been given a chance to become who she was meant to be. The story of the girl in the basement cage became more than just a tragic news story. It became a wake-up call, a reminder that evil can exist in plain sight, that respected members of the community can hide terrible secrets, and that it takes courage to confront uncomfortable truths. Schools began teaching children about their rights, about how to seek help if they were being hurt. Parents had difficult conversations with their children about safety and speaking up. Community organizations formed networks to watch for signs of abuse and provide support for at-risk families. The case changed how the entire state approached child welfare. With new funding allocated for protective services and training programs, Keisha went on to college, studying social work and psychology, determined to use her experience to help others. She wrote a book about her experience, not for fame or money, but to reach other children who might be trapped in their own cages, physical or metaphorical. The book, titled From Darkness to Light, became required reading in many social work programs. She spoke at conferences, testified before Congress about child protection laws, and worked with organizations to improve the foster care system. She never forgot where she came from, but she refused to be defined by it. When people called her a victim, she corrected them. "I'm a survivor," she would say, "and I'm using my survival to make sure others survive too." 20 years after that night, when police found her in a basement cage, Dr. Keisha Williams stood at a podium accepting an award for her work in child advocacy. In the audience sat Officer Marcus Thompson, now retired but still proud of the young woman he had helped save. Maria Santos was there too, grey-haired now but still fierce in her advocacy for children. Janet Rodriguez, now chief of police, wore her dress uniform and wiped away tears as Keisha spoke. James and Patricia Davis, her foster parents who had become her real parents in every way that mattered, beamed with pride from the front row. In her speech, Keisha spoke about the night that changed her life, about the cage that had held her body but never broken her spirit. She talked about the people who had saved her, not just physically but emotionally and psychologically. She spoke about the importance of believing children, of acting on suspicions, of being willing to get involved even when it's uncomfortable. "The title of my story," she said, looking out at the audience, "could have been Black Girl Cries in Basement. Cage, until police arrive and the truth is revealed." But that's not the whole story. The whole story is about what happens after the truth is revealed. It's about a community that chose to change, about people who chose to act, about a system that chose to improve. It's about a little girl who chose to survive and thrive. Every child deserves that choice. Every child deserves that chance. The audience rose to their feet, applause filling the room, but Keisha's eyes were on a young girl in the back row, a recent rescue from a similar situation, who was just beginning her own journey to healing. Keisha smiled at her, a smile that said, "You're going to make it. I'm proof of that." The ripple effects of Keisha's case continued for years. Laws were strengthened, systems were improved, and countless children were saved because people had learned to pay attention, to ask questions, to act when something seemed wrong. Training programs developed in response to the case became models for other states. The Memorial Garden became a place of healing and education, where school groups came to learn about child protection and the importance of speaking up. Every year on the anniversary of her rescue, Keisha returned to the garden to speak to visitors, to remind them that behind every statistic was a real child with real pain and real hope. She would stand before the broken cage sculpture and tell her story, not to relive the trauma, but to ensure it served a purpose as she grew older. Keisha married a kind man named David who understood her past and supported her mission. They had two children of their own, whom they raised with love, security, and the knowledge that their voices would always be heard. Keisha taught them to be advocates for those who couldn't speak for themselves, to stand up against injustice, to never look away when someone needed help. Her children grew up knowing their mother's story, understanding that survival could be transformed into purpose, that pain could be alchemized into power for good. They were proud of her, not despite her past, but because of how she had transformed it into a force for change. The case files from that night in Millbrook were eventually archived, but the lessons learned from them continued to be taught at police academies and social work schools. New officers learned about the importance of thorough investigation, of believing children, of looking beyond surface respectability to find hidden abuse. Social workers studied the case to understand how children could fall through cracks in the system and how to prevent it. Psychologists examined Keisha's recovery to better understand trauma and resilience. Her story became a textbook example, but more than that, it became a touchstone for everyone working to protect children. When cases seemed hopeless, when the system seemed too broken to fix, people remembered Keisha and found the strength to keep fighting. In her 50s, Keisha established a foundation dedicated to preventing child abuse and supporting survivors. The foundation provided free therapy for rescued children, legal support for prosecuting abusers, and training for communities on recognizing and reporting abuse. It also provided emergency safe houses for children removed from dangerous situations, places that were the complete opposite of the cage she had known, bright, warm, and full of hope. The foundation's logo was a butterfly emerging from a broken cage, symbolizing transformation and freedom. Under Keisha's leadership, the foundation helped thousands of children and became a model for similar organizations worldwide. She received numerous awards and honors, but she always said the real reward was knowing that children were safer because of her work. Looking back on her life, Keisha could trace a direct line from that terrified 8-year-old girl in a basement cage to the accomplished woman she had become. The journey had been long and difficult, filled with setbacks and struggles, nightmares and breakthroughs. But she had never given up, never let Robert Garrison's cruelty define her limits. She had taken the worst thing that could happen to a child and transformed it into a lifetime of purpose and meaning. When young survivors came to her, scared and broken, wondering if they would ever be okay, she could look them in the eye and say with absolute certainty, "You will be more than okay. You will be powerful." The town of Millbrook itself was transformed by Keisha's case. What had once been a place content to mind its own business became a community committed to protecting its vulnerable members. Neighborhood watch programs expanded to include watching for signs of child abuse. Schools implemented programs where children could safely report concerns. Churches and community centers became safe spaces where children knew they could seek help. The annual Keisha Williams Day became a time for the community to recommit to child protection and to remember that silence in the face of suspected abuse was complicity. The town that had once failed Keisha became a model for community-based child protection, proving that change was possible even in places where tradition and reluctance to get involved had deep roots. As Keisha entered her 60s, she began writing her memoirs, a fuller account of not just her abuse and rescue, but her entire journey of healing and advocacy. She wanted future generations to understand that survival was just the first step, that true victory came in transforming trauma into purpose. She wrote about the nightmares that still sometimes came, about the therapy that had saved her life, as surely as the police officers had, about the foster parents who had shown her what love really meant. She wrote about forgiveness, not for Garrison, but for herself, for the community that had failed her, for a world that allowed such things to happen. She wrote about hope, stubborn and persistent, that had kept her alive in that cage and continued to drive her work. The title of her memoir was simple, Heard, because in the end, that's what had saved her. Someone had finally heard her cries and chosen to act. Maria Santos, the cleaning woman who had made that crucial call, had passed away by then, but Keisha dedicated the book to her, writing to Maria, who heard when others chose deafness, who acted when others chose comfort, who saved me when the world had forgotten me. At Maria's funeral years earlier, Keisha had spoken about how one moment of courage could change everything, how one person choosing to get involved could start a cascade of justice and healing. Maria's family had told Keisha that making that call was the thing Maria was most proud of in her entire life, that she had often said, Saving Keisha made everything else worthwhile. The forensic evidence from Keisha's case eventually contributed to solving several other missing children cases, leading to more rescues and reunions. The network that Garrison had been part of was gradually dismantled, with dozens of arrests and convictions. Each victory in court felt like a vindication, not just for Keisha, but for all the children who had suffered. Some of these children reached out to Keisha as adults, forming an informal support network of survivors who understood each other's pain in ways others couldn't. They met annually, not to dwell on their trauma, but to celebrate their survival and support each other's healing. These gatherings were powerful, filled with tears and laughter, pain and hope, proof that even the worst experiences could be overcome with support and determination. The cage that had held Keisha became a powerful symbol in the fight against child abuse. Replicas were displayed at awareness events, stark reminders of what could happen when society looked away. But always, these displays ended with the cage door open, with representations of children stepping into freedom and light. Artists created works inspired by Keisha's story. Musicians wrote songs, filmmakers made documentaries. Each retelling kept the urgency alive, prevented complacency from setting in again. The story became part of the cultural consciousness, a cautionary tale but also an inspiring one, showing that evil could be defeated, that children could be saved, that one voice crying out in the darkness could eventually find the light dot. As she approached 70, Keisha reflected on a life that had begun in unimaginable darkness, but had become a beacon of light for others. She had children and grandchildren who carried on her work, a legacy of advocacy that would outlast her. She had helped change laws, transform communities, and save countless children from suffering similar fates. The scared little girl in the basement cage could never have imagined the woman she would become, the lives she would touch, the changes she would inspire. But that little girl had possessed something that no amount of abuse could destroy: hope. And it was that hope, nurtured by those who had rescued and supported her, that had bloomed into a lifetime of purpose and impact. When Keisha finally passed away at the age of 70, her funeral was attended by thousands: police officers, social workers, survivors she had helped, politicians she had influenced, and ordinary citizens whose awareness she had raised all came to pay their respects. The current President of the United States sent a statement honoring her lifetime of service. Children she had saved, now adults with children of their own, spoke about how she had given them hope when they had none. The memorial service was held in the garden that had been built where her prison had once stood. The broken cage sculpture, now weathered but still powerful, still proclaiming that freedom was possible, that chains could be broken, that cages could be opened. Her gravestone bore a simple inscription. She turned her cries into a chorus of change. Below that, the dates of her life, and below that, smaller but still visible, no child should cry unheard. The grave became a pilgrimage site for survivors and advocates, a place to draw strength and recommit to the fight against child abuse. But Keisha's true memorial was not in stone, but in the countless lives she had saved and changed, in the laws that protected children, in the communities that had learned to watch and act, in the ongoing work of her foundation. She had taken the worst thing that could happen to a child and transformed it into a force for good that would ripple through generations. Years after her death, a young girl named Tamara was rescued from a similar situation, locked in a basement, by adults who were supposed to protect her. As she recovered in the hospital, a social worker gave her a book, Keisha's memoir. Tamara read it with tears streaming down her face, seeing her own pain reflected but also seeing the possibility of healing and purpose. She wrote in her journal that night, "If Keisha could survive and thrive, so can I." And she did, eventually becoming a prosecutor specializing in crimes against children, carrying on the work that Keisha had begun, because that was Keisha's greatest gift to the world, showing that survival was possible, that trauma didn't have to be the end of the story, that a child's cries could become a powerful voice for change. The title, "Black Girl Cries in Basement Cage, ... until police arrive and the truth is revealed," had been a headline that shocked the world. But the real story, the full story, was everything that came after. It was about a community learning to see and act, about systems being reformed, about survivors finding their voices, about justice being served and sustained. It was about Keisha Williams, who refused to let her beginning define her ending, who transformed her pain into power, her trauma into triumph. Her story became proof that even in the darkest places, hope could survive, and that when good people chose to act, evil could be defeated. The basement cage that had once held her body had failed to cage her spirit, and that spirit had soared, lifting others with it, creating a legacy of protection and empowerment that would last forever. In schools across the country, children learned about Keisha Williams not just as a victim who was saved, but as a hero who saved others. Her story was taught alongside those of other civil rights heroes, people who had suffered injustice but fought to ensure others wouldn't suffer the same. Teachers used age-appropriate versions of her story to teach children about personal safety, about speaking up, about believing others when they asked for help. The lesson was clear. Every child's voice mattered. Every child deserved protection. And anyone could be a hero by choosing to act when they saw something wrong. Children wrote letters to Keisha's foundation, sharing their own stories or pledging to be advocates for their peers. These letters were preserved, a testament to the ongoing impact of one woman's courage. The police officers who had rescued Keisha that night often spoke about how the case had changed them. Marcus Thompson wrote a training manual based on the case, emphasizing the importance of taking all reports seriously, of looking beyond surface appearances, of remembering that children rarely lie about abuse. He conducted training sessions across the country, always beginning with the story of that night, of finding Keisha in the cage, of the moment when he realized how many people had failed her before he and Janet had arrived. "We were her last hope," he would say, "but we shouldn't have been. Someone should have acted sooner. Our job is to make sure we're never a child's last hope again, that we're their first response." His training saved countless children by making officers more aware, more responsive, more willing to investigate thoroughly. The psychological research that emerged from studying Keisha's case and recovery contributed significantly to the understanding of childhood trauma and resilience. Therapists developed new techniques based on what had helped Keisha heal, particularly the importance of creative expression and having her story believed and validated. Art therapy programs were expanded, recognizing how Keisha had used drawing and writing to maintain hope during her captivity and to process her trauma afterward. The notebook of drawings she had hidden in the basement became a famous artifact, displayed in museums and exhibitions about survival and human rights. Each shaky drawing, each misspelled word of hope, stood as evidence of the human spirit's inability to be completely crushed, no matter how severe the oppression. The legal precedents set by Keisha's case strengthened child protection laws nationwide. The prosecution's successful argument that prolonged psychological torture was as criminal as physical Abuse changed how courts approached child abuse cases. The evidence standards were adjusted to give more weight to children's testimony and psychological evaluations. Garrison's conviction on charges, including human trafficking, even though he hadn't sold Keisha, established that holding a child in slavery-like conditions constituted trafficking. These legal victories made it easier to prosecute similar cases, and harder for abusers to escape justice on technicalities. Law schools taught Keisha's case as a landmark in child protection law, and many students chose to specialize in this area after studying what had happened to her. The foster care system underwent massive reforms inspired by Keisha's story and her later advocacy. The Davis family, who had fostered and then adopted Keisha, became trainers for other foster parents, teaching them how to help severely traumatized children heal. They emphasized patience, consistency, and unconditional love, sharing specific techniques that had helped Keisha learn to trust again. Their home became a model, with social workers bringing new foster parents to see how they had created a healing environment. The extra bedroom they had prepared for Keisha, painted in soft colors with plenty of natural light, the complete opposite of the dark basement, became a template for creating therapeutic spaces for traumatized children. Their approach influenced foster care standards nationwide, international. Attention on Keisha's case led to global conversations about child protection. The United Nations invited her to speak about children's rights, and her testimony influenced international protocols on child trafficking and abuse. Countries that had weak child protection laws strengthened them, citing Keisha's case as evidence of what could happen when systems failed. Her foundation partnered with international organizations to help develop child protection programs in countries where such abuse was common but hidden. The butterfly logo of her foundation became recognized worldwide as a symbol of hope for abused children. When similar cases were discovered in other countries, officials often consulted with Keisha's foundation for guidance on how to help the victims and prosecute the perpetrators. The medical professionals who had treated Keisha wrote extensively about the physical effects of prolonged captivity and abuse on a developing child. Their research led to better diagnostic tools for identifying abuse victims and better treatment protocols for helping them heal physically. The malnutrition Keisha had suffered had long-term effects that required years of careful treatment, and the documentation of her recovery helped doctors better understand and treat similar cases. Pediatricians were trained to look for the subtle signs that might indicate a child was being abused, the kinds of signs that had been missed in Keisha's case. Medical schools incorporated her case into their curriculum, ensuring future doctors would be better equipped to identify and help abused children. The neighborhood where Keisha had been held prisoner underwent a complete transformation. The shame of having ignored the signs of her abuse motivated residents to become hyper-vigilant about child welfare. They established one of the country's first neighborhood child watch programs, where residents were trained to identify signs of abuse and had direct lines to report concerns. The program became a model replicated in communities nationwide, where once there had been a culture of minding one's own business, there was now a culture of collective responsibility for all children's safety. The annual memorial service held in the garden built where Garrison's house had stood became a community recommitment to never again. Choosing ignorance over action. Educational curricula were developed based on Keisha's story, teaching children about their rights, about good touch and bad touch, about how to seek help if someone was hurting them. These programs, implemented in schools nationwide, led to countless children coming forward about abuse they were experiencing. Teachers were trained to create safe spaces where children could disclose abuse and to respond appropriately when they did. The phrase "tell someone until someone listens," which Keisha had popularized in her speeches, became a mantra taught to children everywhere. Schools displayed posters with butterflies and open cages, reminding children that they deserved freedom and safety, and that help was available if they needed it. The entertainment industry also played a role in spreading awareness through Story, a carefully crafted film about her case, made with her input and approval, reached millions of viewers and started important conversations in homes across the country. The actress who played young Keisha spent time with the real Keisha, learning not just about the trauma, but about the strength that had helped her survive. The film didn't sensationalize the abuse, but focused on the rescue, the healing, and the advocacy that followed. It ended with real footage of Keisha speaking at the United Nations, showing viewers that survival and transformation were possible. The film was shown in schools and community centers, always followed by discussions about child protection and community responsibility. Social media became a powerful tool in Keisha's advocacy work. Her foundation's accounts shared information about missing children, warning signs of abuse, and resources for those who needed help. Survivors connected through these platforms, finding community and support. The hashtag #NoChildUnheard became a rallying cry for child protection advocates. When new cases of child abuse made headlines, Keisha's foundation was often the first to offer support to the victims and their families. The digital age allowed her message to reach farther than ever before, saving children in places she would never physically visit. Young activists, inspired by her story, created their own campaigns and initiatives, multiplying her impact exponentially. The religious community also grappled with Keisha's case, particularly those congregations in Millbrook who had accepted Garrison's explanations without question. Many churches implemented child protection policies, including background checks for anyone working with children and training for recognizing abuse. Sermons addressed the moral obligation to protect the vulnerable, using Keisha's story as a modern parable about the consequences of willful blindness. Faith-based counseling programs were developed specifically for abuse survivors, recognizing the spiritual damage that such trauma could cause. Keisha herself, though she struggled with faith after her ordeal, eventually found peace in a progressive congregation that emphasized justice and healing rather than judgment. The business community in Millbrook faced a reckoning as well. Garrison had been a respected businessman, and his colleagues had to confront how they had missed or ignored signs of his evil nature. Companies implemented whistleblower protections that extended beyond financial crimes to include any suspected abuse of children. Business leaders funded child protection initiatives as a form of corporate social responsibility. Corporate leaders who had once praised Garrison's business acumen now funded scholarships for survivors of abuse and supported legislation requiring businesses to report suspected child abuse. The Chamber of Commerce established an annual award in Keisha's name, given to businesses that demonstrated exceptional commitment to child welfare. These initiatives helped transform Millbrook from a town that had failed a child into a community that prioritized child protection above all else. The academic world produced extensive research based on Keisha's case. Sociologists studied how communities could enable abuse through willful ignorance. Psychologists examined the mechanisms of survival and resilience in extreme abuse cases. Criminal justice scholars analyzed how the legal system could better protect vulnerable children. Each study added to the body of knowledge that would help prevent future tragedies. Universities created specialized programs in child advocacy, many of them named after Keisha or featuring her as a guest lecturer. Students who graduated from these programs went on to become social workers, lawyers, police officers, and advocates, all carrying forward the lessons learned from her case. As technology advanced, Keisha's foundation embraced new tools for child protection. They developed apps that allowed children to secretly report abuse using code words and hidden features that abusers wouldn't recognize. Artificial intelligence was employed to scan social media and identify potential abuse situations. Virtual reality programs were created to train professionals in recognizing abuse signs and responding appropriately. These technological innovations, all developed with Keisha's input based on what might have helped her, saved countless children who might otherwise have remained trapped in abusive situations. The foundation also worked with tech companies to improve their platforms' ability to detect and prevent child exploitation. The anniversary of Keisha's rescue became more than just a local observance. It evolved into National Child Protection Day, marked by events across the country. Schools held assemblies where children learned about their rights and how to seek help. Communities organized walks to raise awareness and funds for child protection services. Media outlets ran special features reminding people of the signs of abuse and the importance of reporting suspicions. Government buildings flew flags at half-mast in the morning to honor victims, then raised them full height at noon to celebrate survivors and the ongoing fight for child protection. Keisha often spoke at the main event in Washington, D.C., her voice still strong and clear even in her later years. The impact on the foster care system continued to evolve long after the initial reforms. Foster parents who had been inspired by the Davis family's success with Keisha formed support networks to share strategies for helping traumatized children. Respite care programs were established so foster parents could get breaks without traumatizing children who feared abandonment. Therapeutic foster care became more common, with specially trained parents taking in children with severe trauma. The emphasis shifted from simply providing shelter to providing healing. Foster children were given more voice in their placements and care, recognizing that empowering them was crucial to their recovery. These changes, all traceable back to lessons learned from Keisha's case, improved outcomes for thousands of foster children. The literary world embraced Keisha's story as well. Her memoir became required reading in many high schools and colleges, sparking discussions about trauma, resilience, justice, and social responsibility. Poets wrote verses inspired by her journey from darkness to light. Novelists created fictional works exploring similar themes, always acknowledging Keisha's story as inspiration. Children's book authors created age-appropriate stories that taught young readers about safety and speaking up, often featuring butterflies and open doors as symbols. Book clubs across the country discussed not just the horror of what had happened to Keisha, but the hope inherent in her survival and the changes her case had sparked. Libraries created special collections focused on child advocacy, with Keisha's memoir as the centerpiece. The medical community's response to Keisha's case went beyond just treating physical symptoms. Holistic approaches to treating abuse survivors were developed, recognizing that trauma affected every aspect of a person's being. Nutritionists developed protocols for helping malnourished children recover without overwhelming their damaged systems. Physical therapists created programs to help children who had been confined learn to move freely again. Occupational therapists worked on helping survivors relearn daily tasks that trauma had made difficult. The comprehensive care model developed for Keisha became the gold standard for treating severe abuse cases. Medical schools began requiring rotations in trauma-informed care, ensuring all new doctors understood how to help abuse survivors. The legal reforms inspired by Keisha's case continued to evolve. Statute of limitations for child abuse cases were extended or eliminated in many states, recognizing that children often couldn't report abuse until they were adults. The definition of child abuse was expanded to explicitly include psychological, torture, and extreme neglect. Mandatory reporting laws were strengthened, with penalties for those who failed to report suspected abuse. Legal aid programs were established specifically for child victims, ensuring they had representation independent of their guardians. Courtrooms were redesigned to be less intimidating for child witnesses, with separate entrances, comfortable waiting rooms, and the option to testify via video link. These changes made it easier for children to seek justice and harder for abusers to escape consequences. Environmental designers began considering child safety in their work, inspired by the contrast between Keisha's cage and the healing spaces that had helped her recover. Architects designing schools, community centers, and residential facilities incorporated features that would make it harder to hide abuse. Open floor plans, multiple exits, windows that couldn't be completely covered. Landscape architects created public spaces that encouraged community interaction and natural surveillance, making it harder for abuse to occur unseen. Even private home designs began incorporating features that promoted child safety without sacrificing privacy. The principle that physical spaces could either enable or prevent abuse became a standard consideration in design education. The journalism profession also reflected on its role, examining how local media had failed to investigate despite rumors about Garrison. New investigative journalism initiatives focused on child welfare were established, with reporters trained to carefully and ethically investigate suspected abuse. Media outlets created guidelines for reporting on child abuse cases that protected victims while ensuring public awareness. The sensationalism that often accompanied such stories was replaced with respectful, fact-based reporting that honored survivors' dignity. Journalism schools began teaching courses on covering vulnerable populations, using Keisha's case as an example of how media attention could drive positive change when handled responsibly. International adoption practices were scrutinized and reformed in light of what had happened to Keisha. Although her case didn't involve international adoption, the illegal networks uncovered during the investigation had international connections. Countries strengthened agreements about adoption oversight, information sharing, and post-adoption monitoring. International databases were created to track adoptions and flag suspicious patterns. Cultural sensitivity training became mandatory for those involved in international adoptions, recognizing that children from different backgrounds might express distress differently. The goal was to ensure that adoption remained a way to provide children with loving homes while preventing it from becoming a cover for trafficking or abuse. The artistic community continued to find inspiration in Keisha's story decades after her rescue. Museums hosted exhibitions featuring art by abuse survivors, with Keisha's childhood drawings from the cage often serving as powerful centerpieces. Theater companies produced plays exploring the themes of survival and community responsibility. Dance troupes created performances that wordlessly conveyed the journey from captivity to freedom. Musicians composed symphonies that captured both the darkness of abuse and the light of hope. These artistic interpretations helped people connect emotionally with the issue of child abuse in ways that statistics and reports couldn't achieve. Art became a bridge between those who had suffered and those who needed to understand their suffering, to prevent it. The impact on child psychology was profound and lasting. Therapists developed new techniques specifically for children who had been caged or confined, recognizing that such extreme physical restriction created unique psychological challenges. Play therapy methods were adapted to help children who had been denied normal childhood experiences. Group therapy programs brought together survivors, with older survivors like Keisha mentoring younger ones. The understanding that children could survive and thrive after extreme abuse, but only with proper support, became fundamental to child psychology. Training programs for child psychologists emphasized the importance of believing children, validating their experiences, and empowering them in their recovery. Sports and recreation programs were developed specifically for abuse survivors, recognizing how physical activity could aid healing. Keisha had discovered running during her recovery, finding freedom in movement after years of confinement. Programs were created that used sports to help survivors reclaim their bodies, build confidence, and learn trust through team activities. Martial arts programs taught self-defense but also self-respect. Swimming programs helped children who had been denied basic experiences learn to trust their bodies in new environments. These programs, often funded by Keisha's foundation, provided not just physical activity but community and achievement for children who had been told they were worthless. The hospitality industry implemented new training programs after learning that Garrison had sometimes traveled with Keisha, keeping her hidden in hotel rooms. Hotel staff were trained to recognize signs of trafficking and abuse, to know how to report suspicions safely, and to understand that well-dressed, seemingly respectable people could be abusers. Hidden signs were posted in hotel bathrooms, providing helpline numbers for those who might be trapped. The industry recognized its potential role as a frontline defense against child abuse and trafficking. These programs, developed in consultation with Keisha's foundation, saved numerous children who might otherwise have remained invisible. Agricultural communities, initially seeming removed from urban child abuse issues, found relevance in Keisha's story when investigations revealed that some trafficking victims were being used as forced labor on farms. Rural communities, often with fewer resources for child protection, developed innovative programs using existing community structures like 4-H clubs and Grange halls to educate about child welfare. Farm families opened their homes as emergency placements for rescued children, providing the space and quiet that some survivors needed to begin healing. The understanding that child abuse was not just an urban problem, but a human problem that required universal vigilance spread through rural America. The technology sector continued to innovate in child protection, with Keisha's foundation often consulting on new developments. Facial recognition technology was employed to find missing children. Blockchain technology was used to create unalterable records of adoption and foster care placements. Smart home devices were programmed to recognize sounds of distress and alert authorities. While privacy concerns were carefully balanced, the potential for technology to protect children was embraced. Keisha often spoke at tech conferences, challenging innovators to consider how their creations could help prevent children from suffering as she had. Environmental psychology research, inspired by Keisha's case, examined how physical environments affected children's ability to seek help. Studies found that children were more likely to disclose abuse in spaces that felt safe and open, with natural light and clear exits. This research influenced the design of schools, counseling centers, and medical facilities. The dark basement, where Keisha had been caged, became a negative template, with designers consciously creating spaces that were its opposite. Windows that couldn't be boarded up, multiple points of entry and exit, and clear sight lines became standard features in facilities serving children. The insurance industry, discovering that Garrison had maintained various insurance policies while abusing Keisha, implemented new screening procedures. Unusual claims, patterns that might indicate abuse, frequent accidental injuries to a child. Medical care avoided, then suddenly sought, triggered investigations. Insurance investigators were trained to recognize potential abuse and report it to authorities. The industry's vast data analysis capabilities were turned toward identifying patterns that might reveal hidden abuse. This unexpected ally in child protection demonstrated how every sector of society could contribute to keeping children safe. Public health officials recognized child abuse as an epidemic requiring comprehensive response. Keisha's case was studied in schools of public health as an example of how individual trauma reflected systemic failures. Community health workers were trained to recognize abuse signs during home visits. Public health campaigns emphasized that child abuse was preventable, not inevitable. The approach shifted from treating abuse after it occurred to preventing it through education, support services, and community engagement. Public health departments partnered with Keisha's foundation to implement evidence-based prevention programs. The retirement community, particularly in Millbrook, became unexpected advocates for child protection. Elderly residents who had remained silent during Keisha's abuse felt profound guilt and channeled it into action. They volunteered as court advocates for abused children, using their life experience and available time to support young victims through legal proceedings. Retirement homes partnered with schools, creating intergenerational programs where elderly volunteers provided safe, supervised spaces for at-risk children. These programs provided children with additional trusted adults while giving seniors purpose and connection. Transportation workers, bus drivers, train conductors, airline staff were trained to recognize signs of trafficking and abuse. Keisha's case had revealed how abusers moved children without detection, and the transportation industry committed to being part of the solution. Posters in multiple languages were placed in transportation hubs with information about getting help. Staff learned to quietly offer assistance to children who seemed distressed or controlled. Several high-profile rescues occurred when alert. Transportation workers recognized and reported suspicious situations. The wedding and event planning industry implemented safeguards after learning that some traffickers used fake family events as covers for moving children. Venues required additional documentation for events involving many children. Staff were trained to notice if children at events seemed fearful or controlled. The industry's attention to detail was redirected to child protection, with planners learning to recognize when something seemed wrong. This seemingly unrelated industry's involvement showed how child protection truly required all of society's participation. Veterinarians and animal welfare workers drew connections between animal abuse and child abuse, recognizing that those who would cage a child might also abuse animals. Cross-reporting between animal welfare and child protective services increased. Veterinarians were trained to recognize that families with abused pets might also have abused children. Animal therapy programs were developed for child abuse survivors, recognizing that children who had been betrayed by humans might first learn to trust again through animals. Keisha herself had found healing through caring for a rescue dog during her recovery. A dog that had also known abuse and abandonment. Food service workers, particularly those in schools and community centers, learned to recognize signs of food insecurity and abuse. Keisha's severe malnutrition had been a clear sign of abuse that went unnoticed. School cafeteria workers learned to watch for children who hoarded food, ate desperately, or showed other signs of not being fed at home. Programs were implemented ensuring children could access food without shame or scrutiny. The understanding that hunger might indicate abuse led to increased reporting and earlier interventions. The fashion and beauty industry created programs providing clothing and self-care items to abuse survivors, recognizing how abuse destroyed children's sense of self. Keisha had spoken about how getting her own clothes, choosing her own style, had been part of reclaiming her identity. Programs provided not just basic clothing but opportunities for survivors to express themselves through fashion. Makeup artists and hairstylists volunteered to help survivors preparing for court appearances or job interviews. The industry recognized that helping survivors feel good about their appearance was part of healing. Parks and recreation departments redesigned public spaces to be safer for children while maintaining their function as community gathering places. More lighting was installed, sight lines were improved, and safe houses were designated where children could seek help. Park rangers and maintenance workers were trained to be trusted adults children could approach. Programs ensuring all children had access to safe recreational spaces were implemented, recognizing that isolation made children vulnerable to abuse. The public spaces that had failed to protect Keisha were transformed into protective networks. The title "Black Girl Cries" in Basement Cage, until police arrive and the truth is revealed, became more than just a shocking headline from the past. It became a rallying cry, a reminder, a call to action that echoed through generations. Every professional training, every reformed law, every saved child traced back to that night when officers broke down a door and found a little girl who refused to let her spirit be broken. Keisha Williams had transformed from victim to survivor to advocate to legend, her story woven into the fabric of American child protection efforts. Her legacy lived not in statues or buildings, but in every child who found help because someone remembered her story and chose to act. The basement cage that had once held her had become the key that unlocked systematic change, proving that even the darkest chapters could be rewritten with courage, community, and compassion.